What does it mean to call a mind ideal? For Kant, it is not perfection. It is not a mirror of reality. The ideal mind is the one that holds itself together, a unity strong enough to turn impressions into judgments, appearances into meaning. This unity is not an ornament. It is the condition that allows us to treat a mind as something normal, stable, norm-driven. A mind is not just a heap of associations, nor an infinite plan of reason. It is a structure that relates to objects through judgmental parameters. To call the mind a concrete program that instantiates some meanings and excludes others is simply to say, it exists only as long as the pattern sustaining it exists. There is no hidden essence. A mind is the pattern of operations that organizes experience. And this means the mind can align with the world through many different patterns, some consistent, some conflicting. It does not need to mirror reality in a single way. What matters is whether those alignments work, whether they allow experience to become meaning. To think the ideal mind is not to dream of perfection. It is to see that thought itself is always a negotiation between form and world, between code and life. Kant gave us the blueprint, not for how machines might become human, but for how minds, natural or artificial, must always conform to the law of judgment in order to be minds at all.
What is a judgment? For him, it was habit, the shadow of custom. For Leibniz, it was reason, the clarity of a divine order. But Kant dared a different path. Not skepticism, not rationalism, but the ground of possibility itself. He asked, what makes a mind possible at all? Not as a soul, not as a machine, but as a pattern of alignment between categories, perception, and the fragile consensus of human life. Truth, then, is not a perfect mirror. It is a precarious stability where logic, experience, and history converge. And this brings us to today's debates. Can logic claim an exceptional place, floating above science, immune to revision? Or is logic itself historically embedded, a practice of lived consistency, shaped by how arguments unfold in time, by how thought learns not to stumble? Discourse places Kant at the center of these disputes and shows how his insights anticipate Fodor's language of thought, Carnap's intentional semantics, phenomenology's insistence on lived meaning, and contemporary debates in artificial intelligence. Kant and the idea of mind is not a beginner's course. It is an advanced crossing, guided by research published in peer-reviewed journals. Recent articles in Studios Kantianos and Dissertatio accompany the course as textual correlates, offering rigorous explanations for the arguments you will encounter here. Kant did not only redefine truth, he redefined psychology, and in doing so, he gave us the tools to see mind not as a mirror of the world, but as a fragile space where the world first becomes thinkable.
Imagine the mind as a system of judgments, each one linking a subject to a predicate. The question, then, is simple but profound. What makes a judgment possible? And what gives it necessity? Traditionally, necessity has been explained as non-contingency. We usually think of the strict laws of mathematics or the regularities of the natural sciences. That view is not wrong. But here I want to take another path. Think of necessity as conclusiveness, the way a judgment settles a problem. Even a contingent judgment, like the door closed at 10 o'clock, carries a kind of necessity because it resolves the question of when the event took place. And it is through this lens that I will compare three authors: Hume, Leibniz, and Kant. For Hume, judgments are not grounded in necessity at all. They rest on patterns of association, habit, custom, expectation. A judgment, for him, is the stance the mind takes when it projects regularities. This explains why we expect certain effects to follow certain causes, but it does not explain why such connections must be necessary. Hume does not reject necessity as a description of consistency. What he rejects is the idea that necessity could ever frame an eternal order of reason. What we call necessity, for him, is nothing more than the felt stability of our solutions, not the signature of a timeless rationality. Leibniz, by contrast, aligns judgment with an ideal order. He distinguishes between truths of reason, analytic and necessary, and truths of fact, contingent but still secured by sufficient reason. For him, judgment is not psychological conditioning. It is rational adjustment in an ideal learning process, where the mind uncovers the pre-established harmonies of reality. In this vision, contingency dissolves into a rational plan already inscribed in God's intellect. This approach has great systematic elegance, but it also reveals a limit. Judgments are not explained in terms of the finite capacities of human cognition, and even contingent truths appear as necessities in the making. Given enough time, they will exhibit the pattern that resolves a question conclusively. Yet it is precisely here that we can glimpse its strength. Conceived in this way, a judgment resembles an initial statistical solution, a process not unlike how markets gradually learn from the accumulation of information. Here, markets can judge incompletely, but never wrongly in the decisive sense. Because each partial solution is already inscribed within a broader rational order, error is provisional rather than definitive. The adjustment of judgments is not the correction of mistakes in a finite mind, but the gradual unfolding of an already coherent plan. And of course, sufficient reason cannot be altogether absent, for without it, there would be no judgment at all. It is clear that the conflict between rationalism and empiricism called for a third path in order to mature, since there are questions that neither side can adequately answer. If Hume is right, then the parameter we use to make sense of divergences in how things could have been is reduced to the history of learning and training of a situated psyche. But this creates the difficulty of distinguishing, for example, between a theoretical physicist who knows why the sun will rise tomorrow and a parrot that has merely learned to repeat the sentence. If Leibniz is right, on the other hand, the standard objection is this: if correcting a judgment does not involve any intervention of experience, then the very criteria of correctness lose their footing, and we are left dealing with absolutes in re, as if truth were fixed independently of the finite standpoint of human cognition. We shall see how Kant moves to the very edge of this objection and builds his theory precisely from it.
Let us now turn to Kant, whose position can be read as a critical middle path between Hume and Leibniz. What is at stake here is not simply correcting their errors, but reframing the very question of what a judgment is. Hume had shown that experience, taken by itself, gives us only habits, associations, and probabilities. Leibniz insisted that reason could, in principle, map the entire order of reality with conceptual clarity. Kant's originality was to show that neither approach works on its own. Instead, he redefined what kind of psychology is possible. We mean the possibility of a theoretical frame, a pattern or parameter that makes it possible to individuate a mind, whether through its correlations with the world or through its repeatable structural regularities. This means Kant is working with a new kind of normativity of alignment. And here's the crucial clarification. He does not deny the correspondence theory of truth. He simply refuses to treat it as the ultimate ground. Instead, he interprets correspondence inside a broader framework, an alignment that can include a logical form, empirical experiment, and even socio-historical consensus. Categories of understanding and the forms of space and time are not abstract ornaments. They are the conditions that make experience possible. They show us that any attempt to define meaning versus non-meaning or truth versus error will be sterile unless grounded in the lived conditions of human experience. So Kant gives us more than a compromise between Hume's skepticism and rationalism. He gives us the tools to see truth not as a simple mirror, but as a fragile stability of alignment between categories, perception, and the shared conditions of human life. And here's the final point. The forms of alignment suggested by Leibniz and Hume are not wrong. They only work, however, when consensus has already been pre-aligned. When a general psychology is already possible as a space of absolute propositions, whether in the physiologist who could map behavioral patterns and equate them with meaning, or in the religious doctor of the spirit who could just as well impose his version of what is normal and abnormal within the cultural field where he gained the authority. Kant marks the beginning of a revolution in psychology and even in the very idea of mind, because he shows that there must be a space of reflection before all of this, a transcendental ground where judgment itself becomes possible. Today's class is a rereading of Kant, but not as pure metaphysics. It is Kant seen through the psychology he was already imagining. This is not a psychology of brain centers, not physiology. It is a psychology built on the categories of the understanding, the ways we are hardwired to structure experience. So the first topic is Kant's psychology is already more than psychology because it envisions what a mind could be as a framework that unifies its representations as an experience. Because he frames the mind as a unity is strong enough to hold together every sensation, every impression. The mind cannot just fall apart into fragments. It is stable enough to guarantee experience as a whole. Second topic, the refusal of origin myths. For Kant, there is no blank slate of pure data, and no innate stock of ready-made ideas either. Instead, experience only makes sense because the mind provides the forms, space, time, and the categories. That was his first revolution. So, third topic, explanation versus justification. We can ask how perception happens in terms of causal stories. But for Kant, justification belongs to reason. It's not private, not in any quirky psychology. It is public. It belongs to language, to reasons that others can share. Fourth topic, truth as a fit. Kant breaks the dream of the mind as a mirror. Truth is not a perfect copy of reality. It is a fragile fit between our faculties and the manifold of experience. Later thinkers would radicalize this idea, showing truth as whatever proves fit enough for a time, always bound to history and culture. Fifth topic, normality as a shared health. For Kant, judgment is never just about one individual. It always depends on a community of presuppositions. So the normal is not the sanity of one mind, but the shared ground that allows us to go on together. So we can sum up. Kant gave us a psychology that was also more than psychology. He refused myths of origin. He drew the line between explanation and justification. He turned truth into a matter of fit. And he showed that normality is collective, not private. And this does not mean we cannot fight for the truths we deserve. It means only that truth is never absolute, never mathematical. It is always what proves fit enough for our practices, our communities, and our sense of the normal.
New readings in Kant and phenomenology, fresh insights from my latest research. Hey everyone! Before we dive into today's topic, I wanted to give you a little context for this episode. This podcast is a new experience for me, and at the same time, a way to explore ideas in a more relaxed format. Today's episode is based on a recent article of mine that was just published in Dissertatio, the journal of the Federal University of Pelotas, Brazil. A lot of people are always looking for fresh academic material, so I thought this would be a great opportunity to break down a new publication and see where it takes us. I only recently discovered this video and audio format, and honestly, it's been a game changer for organizing my own thinking. Speaking out loud in a way that isn't as rigid as an academic paper allows me to explore ideas that I probably wouldn't have the courage to write down directly. Spoiler alert, in fact, the thermodynamic metaphor I use in this video to illustrate the difference between active states that trigger a machine or a language of thought and merely liable states isn't in the article. It would, after all, be rather inconvenient for the reviewers to accept the paper with that metaphor, and yet it is a key piece in how I arrived at my conclusions. So perhaps as we go through this episode, some insights will emerge that aren't even in the article itself. Now, a quick technical note. I use AI-generated voices for narration, and much of the script is refined with the help of ChatGPT. I know this might make some people uncomfortable, especially those who are concerned with what's mine and what belongs to the AI. But honestly, I'm not interested in debating who owns what here. My focus is on getting ideas across in the most effective way possible, whether that means writing, speaking, or using tools that help me articulate complex thoughts more clearly. Either way, the goal here is simple: to break down a fundamental philosophical question. What does it mean to talk about meaning? Why can't we just say a green leaf is colored and move on? It sounds trivial, but this question leads to some fascinating debates in philosophy. So, let's get into it. Hey everyone, welcome to 7 Minutes of Philosophy of Mind, where we break down the deepest philosophical ideas into stories and examples that make sense, even if you've never read a page of Kant in your life. I'm Lucas, and today we're talking about something pretty wild. What does it even mean to specify meaning? Why can't we just say, a green leaf is colored and move on? Turns out this tiny sentence hides a deep philosophical mystery. Let's dive in. Imagine you're at a party and someone tells you, hey, all green things are colored. Now that sounds obvious, right? But let's say there's a kid there who hears this and asks, wait, but isn't green already a color? Why do you need to say that? Boom. The kid just stumbled into one of the most fundamental problems in philosophy. Just listing properties of something doesn't really explain what makes those properties hold together. Wait, what? Okay, let me explain. Segment 1, when obvious isn't enough. If I tell you the sky is blue, that's a factual statement. But if I say blue things have color, that's analytically true. It's just built into the meaning of the words. But here's the problem. If meaning were just about stacking properties, we wouldn't need to explain why those properties belong together in the first place. Merely analyzing the sentence, the green leaf is colored, only gives us a material or extensionally restricted depiction. Translation: if we just chop up the sentence logically, we end up with something that tells us only what is trivially true, namely that a thing which is green must necessarily also be colored, because, well, green is a color. This, I regret to inform you, is not a revelation. It is, if anything, an embarrassment to the profession that anyone thought it might be. And that's where philosophers like Kant step in. He says that meaning isn't just about listing facts, it's about the way those facts are structured. You can't just slap words together and expect to have real understanding. You need a deeper framework, a deeper understanding, which one presumes will be delivered to us like Promethean fire, can only be achieved synthetically. That is, it requires an act of actual thought rather than mere analysis. And what, pray, does this deeper wisdom consist of? Oh, nothing more than realizing that green and color stand in a structural relationship to each other, which again is just a pretentious way of saying green is a species of color. So what we have here is the equivalent of taking a perfectly good biscuit, breaking it into crumbs, and then announcing that you have discovered a new culinary science because you have found a structural relationship between flour and food.
Segment 2. The Hidden Structure of Thought. Alright, imagine you're playing Jenga. You have a stack of blocks and you carefully remove one at a time. Now, if you just think of the blocks as individual things, no big deal. But if you understand the way they fit together, the structure, you know which ones you can pull without making the whole thing collapse. Kant says meaning works the same way. We don't just throw words around like green and colored and call it a day. There's an underlying structure that holds those meanings together, and that's where things get interesting. This is where Kant's idea of categories comes in. Categories aren't just words or labels, they're the hidden rules that make sense of what we experience. Kant argued that we don't just passively receive impressions, we actively synthesize them into coherent experience. And Carnap, much later, tackled a similar issue in logic, arguing that statements with the same extension can still have different intentional structures, what he called intentional isomorphism. So what's at stake here? If we treat affirmation and double negation as identical, we risk flattening out the deeper structure of meaning. We need higher order frameworks to explain why certain logical moves feel trivial while others feel informative. Without that, we end up mistaking structural distinctions for mere wordplay. So let's unpack this problem. What does it reveal about logic, cognition, and the way we structure meaning itself? To recall, our initial predicament was this: analyzing the green leaf is colored merely in terms of its logical parts yields only a material or extensionally restricted depiction. That is, breaking it down analytically gives us nothing more than the trivial observation that green is a color, which, as I so charitably pointed out earlier, is not exactly a revelation. What is allegedly missing from this analysis is a synthetic specification, a structure that actually shows the relation between green and color as something substantive rather than merely assumed. Segment 3. Meaning Machines. Now, Kant wasn't the only one thinking about this. Philosophers and logicians have long wondered, how do we specify meaning in a precise way? Here's where it gets fun. Imagine we have little meaning machines. These machines don't just list things, they process them. If your brain worked like a meaning machine, it wouldn't just store these sentences separately, it would recognize that the second one explains why the first one is true. Think of it like a vending machine. You put in a coin, the premise, and get out a soda, the conclusion. The machine doesn't just store the soda, it does something with your input to give you a meaningful result. Kant argues that our brains don't just absorb information, they structure it into a meaningful system. And if we don't understand that structure, we might be missing what meaning really is. Consider instead the inferential structure of meaning as a kind of information entropy, a system that must maintain a balance between fixed structures, the categorical necessity that green is a color, and the energy cost of cognition, that is, the active work of recognizing the relation as a structured whole rather than a mere logical redundancy. Just as a thermodynamic system requires input energy to maintain its state against entropy, meaning requires a kind of synthetic activation to generate a fully functional semantic structure rather than a mere tautology. The core question appears to be, if this is not a pseudo-proposition, how do we represent its specificity? That is, how do we distinguish a proposition, P, from its double negation, not P, in a way that actually matters? One answer, indeed, the answer one might give if one were content to remain within the realm of ordinary sanity, is that in classical logic there is no difference. P and not P are logically equivalent. But of course, Kant wants more than this obvious point. He seeks to expose some deeper, intentional structure, some elusive distinction that escapes mere extensional equivalence. And now we arrive at the crescendo. Just as a machine operates differently depending on its internal configuration, the proposition, "the green leaf is colored," must be understood not as a mere assemblage of predicates, but as a system whose specific relational patterns determine how green and color cohere into a structured whole.
Last T segment. And so, we advance toward the heart of the matter, propelled by the steam-driven logic of our thermodynamic metaphor. If a proposition is to be more than a mere inert arrangement of predicates, if its negation is to be more than a syntactic reversal, then it must possess an internal structural difference, one that is not arbitrarily assigned, but universally determined by the inferential configuration of its parts. A mere negation, not "the green leaf is colored," cannot be merely the absence of its affirmation, lest we fall into the trap of treating negation as a cold void, an unstructured gap rather than a reconfiguration of meaning. No. If the negation is to possess true informational weight, it must generate a distinct conceptual state, a shift in the thermodynamic equilibrium of meaning itself. Just as a machine in one state cannot be reduced to the same machine in another without accounting for the change in energy, structure, and operational constraints. A proposition and its negation must be structurally distinct entities, not merely opposites in name alone. This is where naive formalism fails us. If we define E and not P purely extensionally, we are left with a classification that distinguishes them only in notation, not in substance. It is like labeling two chemical compounds differently while failing to specify their differing molecular structures. But such distinctions are arbitrary unless there exists a universal mechanism by which negation actively reconfigures meaning. Much as an engine shifting from forward motion to reverse does not simply cease moving forward, but undergoes a mechanical transformation with entirely new operating conditions. In short, a negation cannot be a mere grammatical reversal. It must function as a thermodynamic inversion, a realignment of the conceptual framework, complete with new inferential roles, new constraints, and new states of meaning. Otherwise, we are merely relabeling the same phenomenon under a different heading, pretending that a machine in a different operational mode is an entirely separate entity, rather than a structured transformation of what came before. Conclusion: Kant's synthetic theories and an energetic extension of Carnap's intentional framework. Kant's theory of synthesis provides the foundation for this approach. In Kantian terms, cognition does not merely receive impressions passively. Rather, it actively structures them into intelligible wholes. This process is synthetic because it involves the unification of elements into a form that is not reducible to their mere enumeration. In the case of meaning, a purely analytical decomposition, such as affirming that a green leaf is colored, merely restates that green is a color, fails to account for the work required to structure this claim as a meaningful assertion within a conceptual framework. Here, synthesis is an energetically costly operation. It is not just the passive recognition of extensionally equivalent states, but an active, structured differentiation of meaning. Carnap's intentional logic provides a useful but incomplete approach to this problem. His notion of intentional isomorphism allows for distinct inferential roles to be assigned to expressions that may be equivalent in extension, but diverge in their inferential trajectories. However, Carnap remains bound to a largely formal approach. His system specifies criteria for intentional differences, but does not yet integrate the dynamic, process-driven nature of synthesis that Kant emphasizes. This is where the thermodynamic analogy offers an essential augmentation. The distinction between extensionally identical statements, such as P and not P, is best understood in terms of synthetic fuel consumption, just as in a thermodynamic system, where two states of a machine may be formally equivalent in terms of equilibrium, but differ in the energy required to transition between them. Two linguistic or logical expressions may be extensionally equivalent, yet carry distinct synthetic costs in the structuring of meaning. That is, their conceptual processing requires different levels of inferential work, much as different mechanical processes require different amounts of energy to achieve functionally distinct outcomes. Thus, we propose an energetic extension of Carnap's intentional theory, in which intentional distinctions are not merely assigned based on inferential patterns, but measured by the conceptual energy required to sustain them as structured syntheses. This moves beyond Carnap's relatively static view of intentional relations by incorporating Kant's dynamic theory of cognition, where meaning is not just a classification of logical equivalences, but a process-dependent structuring of experience. In sum, the thermodynamic model of meaning allows us to see why mere formal identity does not exhaust the richness of conceptual content. The claim that the green leaf is colored may seem trivial if analyzed in purely extensional terms, but the synthetic effort required to integrate this assertion into an active inferential system differentiates it from its mere logical restatement. Meaning, like mechanical function, depends on structural transformations, which require an investment of synthetic fuel, whether in cognition, inference, or the thermodynamic metaphor of our conceptual machinery.
Postface, the language of thought and the distinction between active and liable states. And now, just when one thought this absurdly elaborate metaphor had reached its natural limits, it dares to take yet another step, into the very foundations of cognitive architecture itself. If our thermodynamic framework has done nothing else, it has at least provided us with a rather entertainingly baroque way of distinguishing between the active and the merely liable components of thought. And this, as it turns out, refines our understanding of what Fodor so fondly called the language of thought. Indeed, if Fodor was right, and one is tragically forced to admit he often was, then thought is not merely a flux of association, but a structured system, one in which discrete symbols interact in computationally governed ways. But here's the catch. Not all symbols contribute equally to the equilibrium of the computational state. Some are active, genuinely engaging in inferential processes, while others, mere liabilities, lurk within the system, passively held but not participating in cognitive transformations. And what, dear reader, makes this distinction comprehensible? None other than our synthetic energy cost model. For just as a machine contains components that actively drive function and others that merely contribute to its structural inertia, a cognitive system must differentiate between inferentially potent symbols and those that merely exist within the system without influencing its equilibrium. The liabilities are akin to unspent energy, present but doing no work to sustain the system's computational operations. Thus, our thermodynamic metaphor, far from being a mere philosophical indulgence, suddenly finds itself with a surprisingly serious application. It suggests that cognition is not merely a set of stored representations, but a system regulated by synthetic fuel constraints, where inferential engagement carries an energetic price. And only those elements which actively contribute to the balance of thought can be said to participate in its structure. And the grand finale? We are told that only then, only by capturing this structure can we truly claim that these species, these recalcitrant Platonic beings, are truly different.
You can express the words round square. You can even write them as a symbolic combination. But when you attempt to genuinely think them, to bring that hybrid form into coherent mental structure, you encounter a breakdown. Think of a machine's architecture, a digital system with inputs, functional pathways, and a set of operable states. Some sequences of commands can be executed and sustained through feedback and error correction. Others, though syntactically correct, lead to logical dead ends, crashes, or infinite loops. Or consider the human brain. Certain conceptual networks can be activated, reinforced, retained across time. Others may generate dissonance, never form stable neural pathways, and remain cognitively inert. Not because they are unintelligible in language, but because they are unrealizable in cognitive operation. This is the difference between representability and instantiability, between symbol and synthesis, between inscription and enactment. And this distinction lies at the core of major philosophical debates today. From the semantics of AI to the logic of contradiction, from normativity to the very structure of thought. This is not simply a linguistic paradox. It reveals a boundary condition of cognition, a point at which meaning itself fails to instantiate. And that distinction between what can be formally written and what can be cognitively realized is at the center of some of the most urgent debates in contemporary philosophy. Susan Haack reminds us that formal coherence does not imply epistemic plausibility. A structure can be logically well-formed, yet meaningless, in a context where understanding and justification matter. Graham Priest, through paraconsistent logic, challenges the classical view that contradiction is always destructive. For him, certain contradictions can be true, or at least manageable, but does that make them thinkable in a lived cognitive system? Mark Lance and Robert Brandom shift the conversation toward material incompatibility, suggesting that logic emerges from the practices of reasoning themselves, from how we live out contradiction, not merely how we write it. And George Ray draws a sharp line between explicit representations and concepts that can actually be instantiated by a cognitive agent. Not every representation makes contact with the structure of mental operation. But none of these concerns are entirely new. Immanuel Kant, in the late 18th century, already asked, "What are the conditions that make a thought possible and intelligible at all?" He argued that we do not access things in themselves, but only phenomena, appearances structured by the forms of intuition, space and time, and the categories of the understanding. Kant's project was not a retreat into abstraction. It was a philosophical confrontation with the very structure of intelligibility. He wasn't telling us what is real. He was telling us what is thinkable. And Kant did not stop at outlining the minimal conditions of intelligibility. He pushed the analysis further, toward the very realizability of thought within consciousness itself. In doing so, he laid the groundwork for a long philosophical tradition that treats self-consciousness not as a given, but as the most stable, mature, and reflexively structured form of any epistemic process. This tradition, extended by thinkers from Fichte and Hegel to Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, traced how our capacity for thought unfolds not merely in logic, but in memory, in temporality, in historical experience, and in the text through which thought sustains and transforms itself. To think, in this lineage, is not only to operate within a structure of categories and intuitions, but to take part in the temporal constitution of sense, where meaning is never isolated, but always embedded in practices, institutions, and narratives of intelligibility. This is why, today, when we speak of artificial cognition, we are not just comparing speed or precision. We are comparing depth of structure. Can a system retain? Can it remember across time? Can it justify, revise, and narrate its own development? Or does it merely simulate coherence at the surface level of syntax? This is not a gesture of skepticism or idealist retreat. It is an analysis of the structural preconditions for any intelligible experience. Kant's point was not to limit knowledge arbitrarily, but to clarify the conditions under which knowledge is possible at all. Today, we are facing an analogous challenge. Artificial intelligence systems can produce language, model probabilistic relationships, and generate sequences of coherent symbols. But the crucial question is not whether they can simulate human outputs. The question is whether they can mean. Meaning is not reducible to pattern recognition. It involves retention, the capacity to sustain a semantic act over time. And in many cases, it involves the ability to confront and hold contradiction, not merely bypass it through. In the 20th century, alternative logics emerged to explore these limits. Paraconsistent logic, for instance, allows for the possibility that a statement and its negation might both be true, without collapsing the logical system. This is an important development in formal theory. It shows that the law of non-contradiction is not inviolable in every symbolic framework. However, there is a distinction to be made. To model a contradiction formally is not the same as to instantiate it cognitively. The former concerns tolerance within a formal system. The latter concerns operability within a representational structure, one that can carry the meaning across time, context, and inference. To instantiate a concept is not merely to state it, it is to embed it in a system capable of sustaining its semantic force. Here, phenomenology becomes relevant again. Phenomenology does not begin with formalism, but with appearance, with the way the world is disclosed in lived experience. It argues that meaning is not an abstraction, but a structure of experience, intentional, contextual, and normative, bound to the subject's position in the world. Jerry Fodor proposed a model of the mind as a symbolic processor, a system governed by syntax and internal representations. But phenomenology would respond. Not all symbols are livable. Not all representations are phenomenologically possible. Some structures, while formalizable, cannot be retained within the flow of experience. This has implications for how we think about intelligence, both artificial and human. Some contradictions are not mere errors in logic. They represent thresholds of cognitive coherence. What we call intelligence in machines may simply be formal processing without access to those thresholds. It may function, but it does not encounter. This course takes that problem seriously. It is not designed to celebrate technology or reject it blindly. It is an inquiry into the conceptual foundations of thought itself. We begin with Kant. We move through phenomenology. We examine contemporary logic and artificial intelligence. And we ask, what happens when systems capable of formal manipulation lose their grip on sense? The course is titled Thinking Beyond the Machine, Kant, Phenomenology, and the Limits of AI. It is intended for those who want more than technical knowledge, for those interested in the underlying structures that allow meaning, error, and understanding to occur. If you feel that contemporary discussions of intelligence ignore the most basic conditions of thought, this course offers a different kind of framework. Not one that promises quick answers, but one that clarifies what the real questions are. A previous course, titled Kant and the Battle Against Superstition, is already available, and it provides the historical and conceptual groundwork for everything discussed here. There, we explore how Kant's critical project was aimed not at limiting reason, but at defending it against confusion, dogmatism, and metaphysical illusion. It's an essential prelude to understanding the stakes of our current moment. The link to that course is in the description.
Welcome, dear listeners, to a discussion that sits at the intersection of philosophy, logic, and the evolution of meaning. Today, I'd like to introduce two of my recent works, both of which engage with a central question in contemporary thought. What happens when meaning is no longer tied to cognition, but instead relocated to the realm of formal structures? How did we arrive at a conception of logic and semantics that, in seeking precision, sometimes risks losing sight of their epistemic foundations? Today, in what can only be described as an act of both intellectual reflection and shameless self-promotion, I will introduce you to two of my recent works, each tackling in its own way the great and ongoing attempt to strip meaning from cognition and relocate it to more respectable mathematical accommodations. Now, I recognize that traditionally, one's work should speak for itself, perhaps discovered in the pages of a specialized journal or debated in the quiet corridors of a university. And I have the greatest respect for these forms of intellectual engagement. But as academic discourse evolves, so too must our ways of sharing ideas. This podcast serves, I hope, as an extension of that tradition. A space where complex arguments can be discussed with clarity and where the questions that animate our work can reach a broader audience without sacrificing depth. The two works I'll be discussing today approach this issue from different angles. The first, forthcoming in Estudios Kantianos, Valencia, re-examines Kant's transcendental logic in light of contemporary debates about logical anti-exceptionalism, arguing that Kant provides a crucial, though often overlooked, perspective on the evolving nature of logic and its role in scientific reasoning. The second, published in Husserl Studies, addresses the question of meaning failure, tracing how the analytic tradition moved from Frege to Carnap and Tarski, ultimately producing a conception of meaning that, in certain ways, has become dependent on a technological and formalistic paradigm. These discussions are not merely of historical interest, they touch on ongoing debates in logic, semantics, and epistemology. They raise questions about whether formal approaches to meaning adequately capture the role of judgment, whether logic is a fixed framework or an evolving structure, and whether meaning itself can be fully externalized without losing something essential about its cognitive role. these questions resonate with you, or even if they provoke disagreement, then I invite you to join me in exploring them further. With that, let's begin. Section 1. Introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, prepare yourselves for a rather distressing revelation. You may have thought that when you utter the word water, you are referring to some mental image or concept, carefully curated within the confines of your own mind. Alas, you are mistaken. Meaning, as it turns out, is not something you grasp. It is, quite fortunately for those with little patience for epistemology, an entirely external affair, governed by reference, set theoretic structures, and, if we are to follow the modern priesthood of formal semantics, mappings to objective reality. What a relief! Philosophy, it seems, has at last been emancipated from the meddlesome subject. But is this really the whole story? Well, the cost is the same as the reward, a fair deal, really. For those who desperately wanted to erase the distinction between thinking and computation, congratulations. Mission accomplished. The grand tradition of formal semantics, with all its truth conditions, model theoretic mappings, and syntactic formalism, has delivered precisely what it promised. A world where meaning is nothing more than a relation between symbols and structures, where judgment is indistinguishable from inference, and where intelligence is just a particularly well-calibrated function. And what a marvel this has produced. We now have machines that can predict text so fluently that they seem to understand it. Artificial intelligence, the crown jewel of this century-long conflation, operates by precisely the same principles that formal semantics championed. Manipulation of symbols, referential structures, algorithmic adjustments, all devoid of epistemic grasp, self-awareness, or intentionality. And yet, something is missing. Even those most enthralled by AI's brilliance can sense it. A machine can generate poetry, but can it mean it? It can write philosophy, but does it think it? It can simulate understanding, but is it really understanding? These questions haunt the edges of AI discourse, lurking in every demonstration of ChatGPT's capabilities. It is uncanny, yes, but also empty. The imitation is dazzling, but it is still imitation. And here's the twist. The very intellectual tradition that paved the way for AI cannot explain why. Of course it can't. When you spend a century insisting that thinking is just inference, that judgment is just computation, that meaning is just reference, you should not be surprised when your theories can no longer distinguish a chatbot from a philosopher. The problem is not that AI has somehow exceeded human intelligence. It hasn't. The problem is that our best semantic theories have flattened the concept of intelligence to the point where the difference no longer registers. For those who always wanted to believe that cognition was nothing but a glorified version of symbol manipulation, ChatGPT is the vindication of their worldview. But for those who see the gap, who feel the absence of something essential, this tradition simply lacks the vocabulary to explain what is missing. And therein lies the irony. The very model theoretic paradigm that made AI possible has also ensured that we can no longer articulate why AI isn't actually thinking. It has given us machines that simulate understanding so well that our own impoverished definitions of meaning can no longer distinguish the real from the imitation. So, well done. The dream of making cognition indistinguishable from calculation has finally come true. But now that we're here, the one thing we can't seem to answer is, what was lost along the way? Section 2. The Paradigm Shift in Language Study. The study of language, once burdened by the weight of cognition, has at last been liberated from such encumbrances. Once upon a time, back in the foggy prehistory of philosophy, meaning was thought to involve something like thinking, perhaps even an epistemic engagement with concepts. But thankfully, the Enlightenment, with its pesky concerns about judgment and cognition, gave way to more civilized pursuits. Or at least it thinks that. You see, language itself has no opinions on the matter. It does not pace the halls of academia, wondering whether it is best understood through Kantian synthesis or Tarskian set theoretic mappings. It merely is, used, abused, twisted, formalized, and, in our more ambitious moments, mathematized. The latter, of course, is the great modern achievement. Instead of asking what meaning is, we have heroically determined that it is best treated as something external, computational, and, most importantly, free from the inconveniences of human thought. Section 3. From Kant to Frege, The Great Escape. Our story begins with Gottlob Frege, that most respectable logician, trained under the ever-watchful eye of Kantian logic. Of course, Frege couldn't entirely escape the past. His Begriffsschrift from 1879 is drenched in the language of judgment, predication, and epistemic commitment. But then came a moment of clarity. Why trouble oneself with the act of judgment when one can instead think in terms of functions and values? By the time of Übersinn und Bedeutung, from 1892, Frege had arrived at a safer conception of meaning, one where reference reigns supreme. No longer was meaning bound up with the mysterious operations of the mind. Instead, Frege gave us a crisp and computable alternative. Meaning reduces to reference. A proposition, merely a function yielding a truth value. A judgment, nothing but a step in logical evaluation. How quaint it must have been to once think of judgment as something more. And so the transformation was complete. Judgment, once considered an act of cognition, was now reduced to a computational step in an inferential process. What was once a rich epistemic event had become a mechanical transition from Sinn to Bedeutung. Thus, we began our long and glorious march toward model theoretical semantics, a framework that drastically departs from the semantic foundations of Kant, foundations that, while still engaged in meaning mapping, held onto something that formal semantics would later discard entirely, the human experience of sense-making. Of course, it would be unfair to suggest that no opposition exists. There are those who have mounted a defense, some from within the fortress itself, wielding the very tools of analytic philosophy against its most extreme consequences. Robert Stalnaker, for instance, has sought to restore a connection between meaning and thought through possible worlds pragmatics. Robert Brandom, taking a different approach, has tried to reinstate the epistemic and inferential dimensions of meaning through a theory of normative commitments. Even David Chalmers, the ever-dedicated champion of consciousness and philosophical zombies, has warned against reducing cognition to mere functional mappings, lest we lose something ineffable in the process. And yet, for all their efforts, the center of the ring remains undisturbed. Their challenges, formidable as they may be, remain internal critiques, still orbiting within the gravitational pull of the very system they oppose. Their resistance is dialectically permitted, even encouraged, as it serves to refine, but never truly destabilize, the overarching framework. The problem is not that they are wrong, it is that they remain opponents in a game whose rules were set long before they entered the arena. Thus, with all due respect to these fabulous thinkers, I cannot bring myself to place my hopes in their hands. I do not see in them a path to reclaiming meaning as something irreducibly cognitive, something that cannot be so easily dismissed as a mere function of reference or computational inference. But let's be clear. I make no pretense of offering some final escape from the iron grip of this paradigm. After all, if even those who have dedicated their careers to this challenge, thinkers of the caliber of Stalnaker, Brandom, and Chalmers, have not yet fully unsettled the foundations of the dominant paradigm, who am I to presume that I will succeed where they have, at best, only begun to loosen its grip? Their contributions are immensely valuable, and it may well be that they are paving the way for a more fundamental shift, one that has yet to fully take shape, but whose contours are becoming increasingly visible. But perhaps as we continue, we might at least have the clarity to see where we stand, to recognize that the system has been built to absorb critique without conceding an inch. And perhaps, just perhaps, the realization of this philosophical predicament is the first step toward thinking differently. Moreover, my own contribution comes with the distinct disadvantage of being retroactive, a step backward, one might say, in an age that prides itself on progress. Rather than seeking the next great theoretical breakthrough, I propose that a return to Kant might serve to refresh our memory in precisely the opposite direction of the forgetfulness that, according to Heidegger, lies at the root of technicism. While contemporary critiques, those of Stalnaker, Brandom, and Chalmers, attempt to reintroduce cognition into a system that has long since externalized meaning, my approach takes a different angle. Perhaps the issue is not just how to modify the current framework, but rather how to recall what was lost in the first place. Section 4. Kantian Alternative. Semantics as an epistemic and existential framework. Unlike model theoretic semantics, which sees meaning as nothing but reference assignments to formal structures, Kantian semantics was grounded in the conditions of human cognition, in the categories of the understanding that structure experience, prevent chaos, and make meaning possible. Kant did not see meaning as an objective feature of language divorced from the subject, but as something inherently tied to the mind's activity of synthesizing experience. This marks the fundamental divergence between the transcendental approach and the model theoretic shift. While model theoretic semantics seeks to establish meaning through formal mappings, Kantian semantics is concerned with something much deeper: the way the human mind navigates the fragile boundary between intelligibility and chaos. In Kant's framework, meaning is not just about correspondence with external structures, but about how cognition actively prevents absurdity, madness, and alienation by structuring experience into conceptual wholes. This foundation, where meaning is inextricably tied to the conditions of human cognition, enabled not only a transcendental account of intelligibility, but also opened the door to the study of dissociation, alienation, and the experience of the absurd. These themes, while not central to Kant's project itself, became crucial in the post-Kantian developments of phenomenology, existentialism, and psychoanalysis, as thinkers grappled with the very breakdown of sense-making, precisely the kind of breakdown that a purely formalist conception of meaning cannot account for. whereas model theoretic semantics assumes that meaning is always neatly mapped onto formal structures, phenomenology, and psychoanalysis, explore the moments when meaning fails, when subjects experience disruption, fragmentation, or the collapse of intelligibility itself. This is particularly evident in Husserl's investigations into crisis and the life world, as well as in Heidegger's account of existential alienation. This, of course, is why Kantian semantics cannot be dissociated from the broader trajectory of German idealism. It is not simply a theory of reference or linguistic truth conditions, but an inquiry into how meaning is cultivated through Bildung, the cultural and intellectual formation of the human being. The post-Kantian shift, particularly in Hegelian and early phenomenological traditions, recognize that meaning is embedded not just in logical formalisms, but in the historical and developmental structures of human cognition. To study meaning, then, was not just to study how words map onto reality, but to understand how subjects come to inhabit a world of significance, how they engage in the self-formation that allows for meaning to be possible at all. It is precisely this epistemic or phenomenological function of meaning, its role in structuring cognition and preserving the coherence of human thought, that is discarded in model theoretic semantics as a mere workshop of philosophical drama. Final section, my work. I have selected 2 works that I would like to humbly bring to your attention, with all due respect to the more traditional avenues of academic engagement. Naturally, one must recognize that new technologies, however unseemly they may appear to those of a more classical persuasion, can hardly be ignored in this regard. Just as a well-timed conversation in the university corridors can soften the austerity of a rigorous article and translate it into the more palatable terrain of collegial goodwill, often yielding doors open rather than slammed shut, so too might YouTube serve a similar function, albeit within rather more modest limits. After all, I have not had the good fortune of maintaining relevance within the institutional universe of academia, so one must make do. For those interested, I recommend 2 works, 2 versions of Meaning Failure, published in Husserl Studies 2023/4, and an upcoming article to appear in Estudios Kantianos, Spain, this April. Kant, Anti-Exceptionalism, and the Phenomenology of Scientific Reasoning, From Transcendental Logic to Scientific Self-Consciousness. These 2 works, though seemingly distinct in their focus, one on Kant's transcendental logic and its relation to modern debates on anti-exceptionalism in logic, and the other on the divergence between analytic and continental conceptions of meaning failure, are deeply intertwined in their critical stance toward the paradigm turn in logic and semantics. Together, they challenge the assumption that meaning and logical structures can be adequately understood through purely technical or extensional means, offering instead a perspective that situates logic and meaning within an evolving, reflexive, and phenomenological framework. As we conclude this discussion, we find ourselves at a familiar philosophical crossroads. On one side, the model theoretic approach continues to formalize meaning within rigid structures, assuming that reference and logical mappings exhaust the nature of intelligibility. On the other, the Kantian alternative reminds us that meaning cannot be divorced from the conditions of human cognition, the very framework that makes experience, thought, and conceptual coherence possible. While model theoretic semantics aspires to precision, it risks overlooking the deeper epistemic and existential dimensions of meaning. the way cognition synthesizes experience, the historical process of Bildung, and the precarious boundary between intelligibility and breakdown. This, of course, is why the post-Kantian trajectory from German idealism to phenomenology turned its attention to precisely those moments when meaning falters. If meaning were merely a function of formal reference, then disruptions in understanding, existential crises, and the fragmentation of sense would pose no fundamental problem. Yet, as Husserl, Heidegger, and psychoanalytic theory have all demonstrated, these moments of crisis are precisely where meaning reveals itself as more than a technical matter. It is an ongoing process, one that is both structured and lived. I have provided references to 2 of my works in the description. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to continuing these discussions in future episodes. Until then, may your categories remain well-structured, your deductions rigorous, and your meaning failures always philosophically illuminating.